Hello and welcome to The Discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for thoughtful conversations about God, philosophy, religion, history, music, and more. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. One question I've had for a while now is, does open truth-seeking conflict with religious commitment? Can someone who is raised religious maintain their commitment throughout their studies of evidence and counter-evidence? Where can one find balance between faith and reason, and where is there potential for tension? That's what we'll explore in this video. The scholar joining and teaching us today earned her bachelor's in philosophy at Kansas State University and her doctorate in philosophy from Notre Dame. For a time, she was a research fellow at Australian National University, and she's currently a professor of philosophy at Toronto Metropolitan University. I was introduced to her work years ago through interviews she did with Capturing Christianity and the Analytic Christian, and then I started reading her actual academic papers, and I've learned a great deal. So, without further introduction, Dr. Liz Jackson, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me on.
Yeah, I'm honored to have you on, and I'm excited to ask you some questions. We'll go from some preliminaries to deeper curiosities of mine, talking about what I mentioned in the introduction, as well as deconstruction, which is another big thing. To begin, this conversation is about the relationship between truth-seeking and commitment to Christianity, as well as the role of deconstruction. So before we get a bit
Mhm.
into the weeds, how do you understand the terms truth-seeking, commitment to Christianity, and deconstruction?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great place to start. Maybe I'll just say like a little bit about each of these briefly, but you should feel free to like follow up if you have further questions. So truth seeking, I mean, maybe we can start with truth. So I take a basic, I would say popular but controversial view of truth, that basically truth is just correspondence to the world. So when you believe something, you want your belief to correspond to the world. I don't want to believe that my meeting is at 4 o'clock when it's really at 3 o'clock, right? Because then I'll be late. Or I don't want to believe that it's raining outside when it's not, because then I won't bring an umbrella. And so that's like the most general sense of truth seeking, is that we want to have true beliefs. We want to have beliefs that reflect the world. What's interesting, though, about this is I actually think all truths aren't created equal. So I think when we say I'm a truth seeker, we don't necessarily mean that we just care about all and every truth, because I don't really care about the number of blades of grass on the park near my house, right? Or the sum of the all the license plates in Toronto. What is the sum of all those numbers added together? And so what I think when we say I'm a truth seeker or truth is important to me, I think what we're actually talking about is that I want to know about important truths. I want to know kind of the answers to these like fundamental life shaping questions. And I think because these questions are important but also controversial, and things like what we want and our emotions and our upbringing and our family and friends, what they think we should believe or not believe, because all of those things can affect what we believe. I think when we say I'm a truth seeker, I think part of what we're getting at is we want to avoid things like emotional attachment or wishful thinking informing beliefs, and rather focus on truth relevant factors like evidence. So that's kind of how I understand truth seeking. We're kind of trying to find what corresponds to the world on important topics, avoiding things like wishful thinking. Um, okay, so commitment. Do you want to say anything about that, or should I just continue?
No, that seems fair. We'll get into
Okay,
some more
we'll
later
get
on,
into
but yeah.
more. Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so commitment to Christianity. I think that's actually really hard to. I think that there's multiple things that could mean, and so it's really hard to say this is what a Christian commitment is. So I basically said I think there's kind of three different ways of committing to Christianity, and I think we should maybe treat them differently. And so I'm happy to kind of talk about all three of these in throughout the course of the interview. Okay, so the first is a commitment to believe Christianity, a commitment to take to be true the central tenets of Christianity, and we can debate about what those are, but arguably God exists, and Jesus is God's son who was sent to the world to save our sins and rose from the dead, something like that. I don't, we can debate about what Christianity is, but a commitment to believe those things would be the first thing. The second would be a commitment to have faith that Christianity is true. Faith is arguably different than belief in a number of ways. And we can also get into that more maybe. But one thing that a lot of people think is different is that faith involves desire and belief doesn't. So I believe there's a global pandemic, or I believe it's freezing cold outside, but I don't have faith that there was a global pandemic because I don't really want it to be true. And so often people think faith involves desire in a way that belief doesn't. So that's one difference. There's other differences we can get into between faith and belief, but that would be kind of the second way you might understand a commitment to Christianity, is a commitment to have faith. And then the third is a commitment to practice Christianity, a commitment to act as if Christianity is true, a commitment to basically take certain actions. And so, like, it's less common in Christianity, but for example, some forms of Judaism actually really emphasize practice a lot more than they emphasize belief. And so I think it's important to kind of keep these distinct: belief, faith, and practice. A commitment could really be each of these things individually, maybe some combination of these things. And so I don't know if there's kind of one straightforward, just like single definition, but I think these three capture like important aspects of what a commitment to Christianity could look like. Okay, so that's commitment to Christianity. And then do you want me to just move into deconstruction, or do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, so you mentioned belief, faith, and acceptance. And in preparation for this discussion, I read a paper of yours called Belief, Faith, and Hope. Excuse
Yeah,
me. And you talk about how each of those factors can justify long-term commitments. They can
yep,
rationalize acceptance. And maybe you could talk about that, but in the paper, you define acceptance as acting as if some proposition P is true. So belief has here, you have a table in your paper. So
oh,
belief,
beautiful, you even have the table, I love it. Yeah, go
yeah, belief has
ahead.
the strongest epistemic component. You talked about truth relevant factors such as evidence, and
Yep,
almost always rationalizes acceptance, although there are, of course, exceptions. Then hope has the
yep,
strongest conative component, which involves desire and what you want to be
yep,
true, and it often rationalizes acceptance, although there are more exceptions. And then finally, faith is kind of a combination. So you said you could
yep,
think of it as different from belief because it involves belief, but it also involves desire. So it wouldn't make sense to say, I have faith that you'll win the game, but I don't want you to win the game. It seems like a contradiction in terms. So, excuse me. So faith virtually always rationalizes acceptance. And that's really interesting and it deserves more thought on my part. But one thing I have thought, though, is that epistemology appears to be more closely linked to acceptance than axiology is. So when we're talking
mm,
about faith-driven commitment, is it fair to say that evidence and belief are more important considerations than hope and desire?
yeah. So I think, yeah, this kind of comes down to like, what is the commitment in question? So if we're
Mm,
thinking that kind of the commitment in question is a belief, or like a belief in maybe a few other things or something, but fundamentally the core of it is a belief, absolutely yes. Like, what makes a belief rational is like uh, evidence and epistemic related stuff mostly. And so I think, yeah, like if the commitment's a belief, yes, evidence and belief are really important considerations and probably like the fundamental things. But if it's something else, I mean, faith I think is more complicated, because faith involves something belief like and something desire like, and it's arguably like this complex attitude. Belief is like in some ways more simple. Faith I think is more complicated, but if it's like a commitment to act, I actually think that hope and desire can play like a pretty big role. You know, how do we weigh one versus the other? Maybe that's a hard question, but I wouldn't say that like evidence and belief are the most important when it comes to commitment to act, because like what's at stake, what you want to be true, all of that plays a really big role when it comes to rational action. Maybe I can give like a quick example of that, so like that
sure.
is more concrete to the listener. So one example I talk about in the paper is, let's say your sibling goes missing, and you've been looking for them for a long time, maybe a couple weeks at least, and the evidence you have that they're dead is growing a lot. It might be even to the point where you don't believe that they're alive anymore, so you might be withholding belief, and you might even get to the point where you say, like, I think I believe that they're dead, but I still think that there is some chance that they're still alive. And it would be such a good thing if I continued to search for them and they were alive. So I have this really strong desire that they're alive, even though I think the evidence probably on balance supports that they're dead, it could be rational to continue to search for your sibling because of how much you have to gain if they are alive and you find them. So that would be an example of a case where if we're talking about a commitment that's an action, what you should do is continue to search for them. But if we're talking about, well, what should you believe about your sibling's whereabouts or whether your sibling is still alive, then I think, yeah, your belief should reflect the evidence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So when I'm talking about commitment to Christianity, I think I'm I'm trying to consider what I mean by that. I think I'm mostly talking about acceptance, so rational action.
Mm-hmm.
Because yeah, when it comes to believing Christianity or mere Christianity, the central tenets, the epistemic factors are most important, the evidence. But I think the root of my question is about when it comes to practicing and continually practicing Christianity as a lifelong thing.
Yeah.
Both the belief and the hope and together the faith is important, but I'm wondering which is more important, or are they equally important, the epistemic and the conative?
Yeah, I mean, the way I would cash this out, and we don't really have time to get into all the details here, but you can, like, really decision theory kind of gives you the answer here. And decision theory really does take both of those as inputs, the evidence related stuff and then the utilities or the desire related stuff. So I would say when it comes to rational action, both can be equally important. And it just depends on the case because it depends on like how much is at stake, right? So in the case of your missing brother, there's quite a lot at stake, right? But if you like lost your favorite pen, you probably shouldn't be like searching for it for weeks and weeks just because you want to find your favorite pen. So yeah, I mean, I think maybe the most simple answer is that when it comes to action, both like have a maybe equally important role to play. And like how they balance out and what ends up being rational will depend on the case. And that kind of gets into some technicalities and decision theory. But when it comes to belief, yeah, the epistemic stuff is going to play the more important role. So that would kind of summarize the view.
Okay, I see that. And
Yeah.
then expanding on that, you talk about how if you're trying to figure out how desire can rationalize acceptance, what's important is kind of the outputs. Is that how you described it? Like what could be gained if it's true and what could be lost if it's not true. So in the context of
Exactly.
say religion, what could be gained if you accept the right one, which seems like it's an oversimplification of what religion involves and what religious commitment involves. But for now, just if you're
Yeah.
practicing the right religion or you're devoted to God or something, then the output could be something great. You could gain so much. You could not just like gain as in material benefit, but you could be in relationship with God, and that's
Yeah.
wonderful. And so, what do you think could be lost if it's not true, right? Because you have to consider both elements. I mean, it seems like the main
Yeah.
the main consequence of believing something that's false is just that truth itself has value. So if you're practicing something that's not actually true, then the con or the negative is just, I mean, your intellectual maturity almost. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I guess we need to think about like two cases. So one case is where, like, let's say you believe either like God exists or a certain religion is true, and that belief is false, right? The other case would be a case where you're like acting on or accepting that God exists or a certain religion is true, and then that God doesn't exist or that religion is false. So the first one would be the case where one thing you're definitely losing is, you have a false belief, right? There could be other things as well, especially if that belief leads to action. Religion arguably does, require a decent amount of commitment, tithing, centering your life around that religion. Those things are definitely worth thinking about. Of course, too, like especially this comes up in discussions of Pascal's wager.
Right.
Different religions have different things to say about people that believe in God but are practicing the wrong religion. But it's not always clear that that's going to be the same situation for the people practicing the right religion. So that's often known as like the many gods objection to Pascal's wager. So that's worth thinking about as well. But yeah, I do think distinguishing, like, you could be practicing the religion but not necessarily believe it, and that wouldn't lead to the false belief. So I think it's worth distinguishing, what is there to lose in the belief case versus what is there to lose in the action case. But yeah, I do think, thinking about both, maybe whatever costs there are to practicing the religion in this life, and then also, if you're wrong about it, could there be costs, in the next life as well? Those are all things worth considering.
Yeah, for sure. And this gets me thinking of intellectual openness. So, a number of passages in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible seem to strongly suggest that unwavering commitment to the Word of God is a spiritual virtue. So, I was wondering how this is consistent with the intellectual virtue of openness. I mean, here, the oft made analogy of commitment in religious life to commitment in marriage, it seems to fall short because it doesn't seem virtuous to be open to a variety of potential partners, even when you're already with someone, while it does seem to be virtuous to be open to a variety of potential worldviews, even when you already accept one. So, are my intentions or are my intuitions here misguided, or is there tension between religious commitment and intellectual openness?
I think this is a really interesting question. And part of what I think is really interesting about it is like, I think there is something to be said for your intuition, but what that actually says is that, practicing a religion, it might actually enable more open mindedness than other commitments that we think are reasonable and rational, like a marriage commitment. You know what I mean? Because if in a marriage you can't be open to a variety of potential partners, but we think it's reasonable to get married, people get married all the time, that's not an irrational thing, in a monogamous marriage, of course. But then, like, we're hating on religion. It's like, well, actually, religion allows for a greater degree of openness than marriage does. So that's one thing that I thought was really interesting about this question. But I do think, yeah, it's worth considering under what conditions is it rational to give up a marriage versus under what conditions is it rational to give up a religion. I mean, that's one question. And then a second question is, given I'm in either a religious commitment or a marriage commitment, to what extent can I kind of explore other options, right? So both of those questions are really important, and I think the answers are really complicated and controversial. Like in a marriage, for example, there's a lot of debate about, like, at what point is it okay to start pursuing divorce? And I think a lot of people would say, if you think you chose a bad partner, in an extreme case, they're being unfaithful to you or abusive or something, like, absolutely you should give up that commitment. And I think some people think that it could even broadly, maybe more broadly, be okay if things just really aren't working out or you're not a good match or whatever. There's obviously debate there. Um, but I also think too, giving up a religious commitment, yeah, I mean, you could give a similar kind of story there, which is like, if you think you chose the wrong religion or you chose a bad religion, in the same way, if you think you chose a bad partner, maybe it could be okay to give up that religion. I do think there's an interesting question here about whether, and this kind of comes back to what you were bringing at the beginning about deconversion. Can you kind of just like give up all your religious beliefs and just start from a neutral place or whatever? I think that's a really interesting question, and it actually reminds me of Descartes. Descartes, in the Meditations, he did what he calls the method of doubt, where he tried to doubt everything. He tried to kind of give everything up and just like build his foundation of knowledge from the most basic thing, and that's where he gives the cogito, I think therefore I am. And then from there he kind of tries to build up and give these arguments for God or whatever. And I think most philosophers think that a lot of that building up isn't fully successful, and there's a lot of questions about kind of the way Descartes does it. But I do think the method of doubt can be really instructive and interesting to think about. Like, is there a place kind of in the Christian life? I mean, this is kind of our question, right? In the Christian or in the religious life, to kind of give up and start from neutral, and if so, what might that look like? So yeah, I know I kind of started answering your question and then got up on a little bit of a tangent, but I think there's a lot of really interesting similarities, but also some differences about religion and marriage. And yeah, I think one of the main upshots is that, insofar as your intuition is correct, there might actually be more openness to exploring within religion than there is within marriage.
Hmm. Now, I have a question about how your credences being lowered can affect
Mm.
your acceptance. But before we talk about that, could you
Yeah,
explain to our audience what a credence is? Because I mean, this is your area of
great.
expertise.
Yeah, no, this is really good because sometimes it's easy to jump in and not just like start with the basics. So, a lot of epistemologists think we basically have two kinds of attitudes when we're thinking about the way that the world is, and these kind of reflect the world. So, the first are beliefs, And basically for any statement, you can believe it, you can withhold belief on it, or you can disbelieve it. So, I believe 1 plus 1 equals 2. I believe I'm looking at a computer screen right now. I withhold belief that there's an even number of hairs on my head or that there's an even number of stars. And I disbelieve that, 1 plus 1 equals 3 or that it's like 75 degrees outside, right? It's like January in Toronto. Okay, so we have belief, we have withholding, and we have disbelief. But notice, I might believe it will be cold tomorrow and believe 1 plus 1 equals 2. But I'm more confident that 1 plus 1 equals 2 than that it will be really cold tomorrow. And so a lot of epistemologists think this sort of 3 attitude model can't capture everything. We need something else, something kind of like a level of confidence. So how confident are you that it'll be cold tomorrow? Or, maybe that it'll snow tomorrow. Let's go with that example. Let's say I check the forecast on my phone and there's like a 90% chance of snow. So maybe I'm 90%, or they sometimes will do it as 0.9 confident that it will snow tomorrow. Whereas like I'm 0.5 confident that I have an even number of hairs on my head. And my confidence that 1 plus 1 equals 3 is basically 0. So you can kind of think about belief on the one hand as involving these 3 attitudes: belief, withholding, disbelief, and then different levels of confidence we can take towards these propositions that we then believe, withhold, or disbelieve. So these levels of confidence often you can see as measured from 0 to 1 or 0 to 100. It doesn't really matter. That's what is known as a credence. So it's sort of like a probability, the probability you would give a certain proposition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And in one of your videos called Belief, Confidence, and Faith, and I'll put it in the description, you use an example of someone having faith that God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent, but the experience or the problem of evil lowers their credence. That is, it kind of lowers their confidence
Mm-hmm.
or how probable they see the existence of God. Thus, they become less confident in God's positive properties, yet you argue that they can still believe God is perfect, partly because of how good it would be if they did believe it and they did accept it and it was true. But in practice, how could you go about worshiping with full sincerity when you're not confident in God's power and goodness? So, a potentially major challenge for Christians who seek truth is not necessarily about whether or not they can remain a Christian, but rather about how to put your whole heart in it, as it were. So, granting that one may be justified in accepting Christianity even with low credences, a deeper question is, how can one be a genuine, deeply devoted Christian if their credences are low?
I think this is a really good question and something definitely worth thinking about. And I guess I just do want to say, maybe just like as a comment on what I was trying to get at here, is that I think because people tend to really just focus on belief and not think about credence as much, they think like, oh, as soon as I encounter some counter evidence or as soon as I see the problem of evil, I have to just give up that belief in order to be responsive to the evidence. And so part of what I was trying to point out is, well, no, you can like lower your credence, but doesn't mean you have to give up the belief. Like in the same way that like if there's a 90% chance of snow tomorrow and then that goes down to 85, I could continue to believe it's going to snow tomorrow, even though I have a little bit of evidence, like less evidence that it's going to snow. I've gained some counter evidence. So that was what I was trying to get at. But I think your question is great, which is like, what does it look like to be a devoted Christian with a like low credence? So there's a couple things to say. I think the first thing I want to say is like, I don't necessarily think it, it's hard, but at a certain point, your credence is going to be too low, right? At a certain point, you should give up, Christianity. And if you're just like almost at 0 or just like the counter evidence is just like enormous, I'm not saying like continue in that commitment no matter what your credence is, because actually that's part of what's cool about this model is that there's something tracking the evidence. And then at a certain point, given you get so much counter evidence tracked by your credence, then you should give that belief up. So I think that's the first thing to say, is that I'm not necessarily saying, just continue your commitment to Christianity, no matter the evidence, especially if that commitment, we're talking about a belief. Um, okay, so that's the first thing to say. Second thing to say, what does this look like, though, if we say we do have someone, they've encountered a decent amount of counter evidence, they've lowered their credence a decent amount, but they're continuing to believe Christianity. Like, what does this look like? Well, I do think this is actually a feature of a lot of our everyday beliefs, because maximal confidence is actually something that's pretty rare. Even that, like, I'm doing an interview right now, or there's a computer and a desk in front of me. I could be dreaming, I could be in the matrix. This is also like flashing back to the Descartes thing, but I don't have credence one that I'm doing the interview right now. I don't have credence one that there's a desk here. So I do think beliefs and credences below one are quite common. Um, and then like take like, maybe your stance on some controversial issue. Like maybe you believe like if you're like either pro-life or pro-choice, we don't even have to say which one. But like I think a lot of people that have one of those stances or another, because the abortion issue is so difficult and complicated, they probably shouldn't have a credence of one or even close to one. Like their credence should be like quite a bit lower. So when it comes to these controversial issues, I actually think this is like at least a commonly rational thing, and ideally hopefully like a common thing, that we do have beliefs about these controversial matters, but our credences are not super super high. So that's one thing to say, is like I think this kind of attitude isn't that uncommon, but I do want to talk about like what does this look like for a Christian. I think that's a really great question. And I do like, so I think one thing to say is like, this Christian still thinks there is some good evidence for Christianity. I think it's probably going to be really hard to do this if you think Christianity is more likely false than true. So you are going to think there's still some good evidence for Christianity. But I think in those moments of doubt, or those moments where you say, wow, look at all this counter evidence, what do I say about the problem of evil? One thing to think about is how good it would be if you continue in that commitment and God does exist. Think about that brother example we talked about before. You might be like, oh, I'm getting all this evidence. I don't know if my brother's still alive. But like, what if he is still alive? And you can continue to search for your brother because of how good it would be if your brother was still alive and you found him by searching for him. And that is kind of how I view what's going on in the head of especially Christians with like getting on the lower end of the credence scale, but maybe still believe Christianity, is they're saying it would be so good if I continued in this commitment and God did exist. Like, not only like heaven or whatever you can throw out there, but like the relationship with an all powerful, a good creator. Some people think like the Christian story itself is really, really beautiful. And so I think you can be motivated by the goodness of it, and also knowing that it's not like your evidence is decisively saying this is false. And that kind of mindset is sort of the phenomenology that can help you continue in the commitment. And so I actually think, and maybe moving towards a more general conclusion, is that I think we should be more okay with uncertainty, because I think being really, really certain of things is actually often not rational. I think that oftentimes it's easy to take a view and then just push your credence all the way up to one or all the way down to zero, when really most of your credences should kind of be hanging in the middle. And that doesn't mean we can't have commitments and we can't have really important commitments, but I think a lot of times Christians and people in general think like certainty is the ideal, when really it's not. And actually, certainty can represent a sort of closed offness to new evidence, whereas that's really not what we should be going for. We should want our credences to kind of accurately reflect where our evidence is, and not always just try to like be certain about everything that we believe.
I appreciate that, especially because a religious belief is more than just like a controversial opinion. Like, as you said, it could
Yeah.
involve a personal relationship with a god, and so it's kind of because religion is controversial. It's like one of the two things that some families say: don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion. So it is controversial, but
Mm-hmm.
it could also be compared to a friendship or compared to a paternal bond or something. And so in light of that, in light of the more relational aspect of religion, you want to think about how good it could be if you could maintain the relationship. But let's say like you're with a friend, because God is in a sense a friend. Let's say you're with a friend and you're becoming less and less confident that they actually care about you, that they have your best interest in mind, or that
Mm.
they value your friendship. Or I mean, say they're an online friend that you met through social media, and you're becoming less and less sure that they're even real, right? Um,
Yeah.
you ask a question like, how low can you go? Your credence doesn't have to be, and it
Mm.
probably shouldn't be 100 or one. So how low can you go when it comes to not just a controversial opinion, but something that is both controversial and potentially relational?
Yeah, this is good because it actually kind of comes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, which is how much do you have to gain and how much do you have to lose,
Right.
right? So that's going to kind of be a really big factor to think about in the interplay here. So if you're thinking about like an online friendship, for example, I think that's a really interesting and good question to think about because it is actually becoming so common these days. I saw this graph that was like the number of couples that meet in all these different ways versus the number that meets online. And the graph was like for the online, and like they're just like that's where everyone's meeting each other apparently in romantic relationships now. So, anyways, side note. But yeah, I think it's a great case to think about. So if you're just like, oh, should I like go chat with this person again or send them a quick message? You don't really have that much to lose there, you know? And so then I think like, yeah, you could continue like in the relationship, like chatting it up with them or something. But like, it's really different when you're like, oh, should I like go drop $1,000 on a plane ticket to like go meet this person in person that I've never met? Because then you not only have the money to lose, like you have the time to lose, you have embarrassment, you know, all these different factors. And so in that case, I think you should be like a lot more certain that they exist compared to the case where you're just like sending them a message and hoping they'll respond. So I think you really will need to kind of weigh the costs and benefits of how bad, you know, how bad would it be if I was wrong and how good would it be if I was right to kind of determine this. And when you're like maybe unsure about those values or I don't know. I mean, I do think point 0.5 can be like a nice like round number to think about. Like if you're above point 0.5 and you think it's more likely to be true than not, then in a lot of cases where maybe those values are like roughly equal or whatever, you should continue to go ahead and you know you can continue with that commitment. And if you're below point 0.5, maybe you shouldn't. But there can be cases where the values are so extreme that the point 0.5 marker won't be helpful. So in the case where like you're going to like drop all of your bank account on a plane ticket to go meet someone, maybe it should be above 0.5. You know what I mean? And then also will depend on how much you have to gain too. Like if they're the perfect person for you and like your absolute soulmate in every way, then you know maybe you're confident. You know, so these are the kind of things that are going to determine you know how confident we should be to continue the commitment. And I know that like case by case basis is not the most satisfying answer, but thinking about you know what if I'm right, what if I'm wrong, that's going to kind of be the key here. That you know unites all the cases and answers the question about rationality. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And this is also making me think throughout this conversation, we've been mostly talking about someone who sees it as a good thing or a potentially good thing
Mm-hmm.
if the religion they were raised in is true and they're coming across counter evidence so their credences are being lowered, but they still see it as a good thing. And so that's something I could maybe relate to more. But another interesting thing is
Yeah.
what if they're in a similar scenario, maybe above zero point 0.5 in terms of credences, so they still see it as somewhat plausible that the religion they inherited is true, but in this case they don't see it as a good thing, right? And so now we're talking less about
Mm-hmm.
the epistemic factors and more about the axiological or cognitive factors, and so they desire
Yep.
it either to be false or they're just becoming skeptical that this is a good tradition in which they were brought up in, or they're becoming exposed to other traditions and they think comparatively theirs is inferior. And so what about how should we think about a scenario like that where it's similar to the one we've
Mm-hmm.
been discussing, except in this case they actually don't want it to be true?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great question because I think you sent me a question beforehand about like what are cases where deconstructing could be
Right.
reasonable or something like that, or how you know when it, and like I think this is actually something definitely worth exploring and thinking about more. Because yeah, I think it's easy to take for granted, like obviously if a religion is true or whatever, but it actually can be really person dependent. And one like really serious example of this is people that undergo like religious abuse or religious trauma.
Oh, right.
In those cases, people have had horrible experiences at the church, maybe been abused by ministers or religious leaders, and that whole association for them, I mean, it's just horrible and it just causes PTSD and all this stuff. And so, you know, I think ideally the church is a place where those people can find a home and can be welcome and comfortable, but that's the ideal, right? And so for to say to them like you have to continue going to church or you're irrational, like I can't bring myself to say that. And Michelle Panchuk has some really nice work on this, on religious trauma, what that means for cases of deconversion. And I mean, I think one thing to conclude from all of this is that churches need to be really, really sensitive to this and like listen to these people and do things to, you know, make church more welcoming and open to them. But I think that's like a really important and serious case where like the cognitive stuff can make a really big difference to the rationality of deconstruction or deconversion. So Michelle Panchuk is someone, again, whose work I really recommend on that.
Interesting, because I often hear apologists almost. I'm not gonna attribute any malicious intent to them, but they almost dismiss negative experiences with the church
Yeah.
as kind of an emotional like just an emotional reason to reject Christianity, and really you got to look at the evidence. So it seems like you're saying the opposite of that. Would you say that negative personal experiences with the church and at its most extreme religious trauma and abuse can make deconversion rational in many cases?
It definitely depends on the case and on the situation, but yeah, I mean, I think you can't on the one hand say, "Oh, the goodness of a possible relationship with God," like a Pascal's wager style argument, that's a great reason to continue in your
Mm,
religious commitment or make a religious commitment. And then on the other hand, like ignore cases of people that have had these awful experiences with the church and like have no desire at all to, be a part of something like that because of abuse or because of other things. So I think like you can't have your cake and eat it too on that. Like if the cognitive stuff matters, it needs to matter in both cases. So that's kind of what I would say there. And I think like one thing I want to highlight here is like I don't want to be exclusive, right? And I don't want to say like if you've been abused, you can't come to church because it's irrational. I mean that would be taking it too far either. So I want to say like, hey, churches need to be thinking about this kind of thing, trying to be welcoming in light of these people's experiences, listening to these people. Like these people often aren't even listened to; they're just shunned and dismissed, which is awful. It's so horrible. But two, like there's a difference between saying you have to deconvert or deconversion is permissible or understandable given your
right.
situation. So I also don't want to make the claim like they have to deconvert. I would hope actually that they could find a church where they feel welcome and comfortable. But I do think, like I said, those desire-based factors, we're gonna have to let them have weight on both sides of things, if that makes sense.
Hmm. I appreciate that because I think I tend to think in terms of rational, irrational, but there's or ethical or unethical, but there's also like supererogatory things which are not necessary for you or obligatory, but it'd be good if you did do it, and things that aren't
Mm,
necessarily, oh, you if you want to be rational, you have to do this or disbelieve that, but rather what you talked about, the distinction of it being permissible. And before
mm,
deconversion happens, if it does happen, a lot of times there's deconstruction that involves, which is something we were about to talk about at the beginning. So,
yeah.
how would you define deconstruction?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I think it's hard because it's kind of used in different senses. So, like,
Right, right,
a
right.
kind of like innocent sense is just the Descartes thing, right? The method of doubt. You're just kind of examining one's beliefs, seeing if they make sense, seeing how they fit together. Descartes went so far as kind of to give them up to just to build them back up again. And so that's kind of maybe the more innocent way is just kind of going through and examining your beliefs. And I think it would be completely uncontroversial, pretty much by everyone's lights, to say that that's rational. Like, yeah, you should examine your beliefs, obviously. It's funny though, because a lot of people still don't, but we can put that aside, I guess. But that said, more recently, I think deconstruction has kind of taken on like this thicker meaning. And it's really popular, especially in kind of evangelical Christianity, meaning something more like deconversion. I mean, there's more and less extreme strands of it. So some strands you just like they're much more dismissive of Christianity. Other strands, you kind of like give it up to in order to like examine it more fully. And I want to say too, like I don't necessarily want to be here preaching like all deconstruction is bad. I think deconstruction can be important and can be healthy. I do have my doubts maybe about the ability to take a neutral stance or just like neutrally examine one's beliefs. Like it's interesting to think about. There's complicated psychological questions here, but like, does giving up your beliefs give you a better stance to examine them than not giving them up? That's a really interesting question. We're thinking more about for sure. But I do think it can be really hard to take like a neutral stance to give up everything and then come back to it because I think we're always going to be coming to the evidence with certain assumptions. So anyway, but yeah, that's how I understand deconstruction. There's like the innocent sense and then the more the thicker sense.
I mean, when you were talking about the innocent sense, you said it'd probably be pretty uncontroversial to say, "Oh, that's good to just assess your beliefs." But
Yeah.
I've heard many Christian leaders commend that commend a limited version of deconstruction, saying something like, "It's good to deconstruct the secondary details of your faith, as long as you remain firm in the foundation of Jesus." And so they kind of,
Mm,
when they talk about deconstruction, they see the foundation, like mere Christianity, as off limits in a sense. And so like they'll
mm.
say, because they'll talk about faith as a house, right? And you can, oh, can you see? Are we not on this thing?
I don't know. I
Okay.
can't see my video, but
Okay,
but I like
then I won't show that thing.
but it's
But
good. I think we get it. The picture is great. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so they'll talk about, um, I mean, they'll say things like you can deconstruct or assess, question models of inerrancy, but what if deconstruction involves questioning inspiration itself? Or they'll say you can explore different and new interpretations of Jesus' words, but what if someone wants to assess how we even know what the historical Jesus said? And so
Right.
they'll commend just a very limited version of deconstruction, but I don't know if everyone sees, or if even most Christians see, assessing the entirety of Christianity, including the foundation, as a good thing. So, do you
Mm.
see it as a good thing? Like which ones can be healthy and reasonable, and which could be dangerous?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a really, really good question. And I think too, like these people that are saying it, I kind of want to dig more into like what they're actually claiming, because it almost it almost seems like they're saying like these certain things that they view as like the fundamentals of Christianity. Like, are they saying you should be absolutely certain of those? Like, you can't
I
even
don't think so. It's
like you
just
can't
that
move down to 99. Like, or yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
I think it's that they're talking to a Christian audience, right? And so they
yeah,
say, yeah, you should question, you don't want to be dogmatic about like a literal interpretation of Genesis. So you can be open to assessing that, but you want to remain firm in Jesus. Maybe not, a credence of one,
yeah,
like maximal confidence, but still not being open to the possibility of, oh, even Jesus is wrong, because that's what deconstruction often
yeah.
involves. Like, I don't think or anyone else who is deconstructed would say I was thinking Jesus is wrong about this, but it's just being open to all sorts of different possibilities.
Yeah. Well, let me just start by saying this. I do not think that being a committed Christian requires you to ignore evidence or be epistemically irrational, right? So I don't want to make a claim about what they're claiming or what they're not claiming, but if you encounter a good argument against Christianity, or if you're struggling with the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness, I do not think the best response to that is to stick your head in the sand and ignore that evidence and just like repeat to yourself the mantra that Christianity is true. So I'm not saying that that's what they're saying, but like it does seem like there's a place for being sensitive to evidence for and against everything that we believe. That includes fundamental things like whether God exists, whether Christianity is true, whether Jesus rose from the dead. I mean, and that is like, I guess it's just a little confusing to me because that is like what we're doing when we're giving arguments for God's existence, or when we're giving arguments for the resurrection, is that we're giving positive evidence for those things, ideally like raising your confidence or your credence. And so it seems completely reasonable to me to also do the opposite and consider arguments against those things, even if that might lower our credence. So I don't want to say that any of these things are just like immune from considering the evidence or immune from looking at the arguments for and against. I think all of these things should be things we're looking at the arguments for and against. Okay, so that's the first thing to say. Don't be epistemically irrational. Christianity does not require you to ignore evidence. The second thing, though, is I think part of what's cool about thinking about faith and epistemology is that we can think about models in which you can be sensitive to that evidence. It, okay, sorry, I thought I cut out. Did I cut out?
I think you're
No?
good.
Oh, okay. My screen froze, but it must have just been me. Anyway, you can be sensitive to that evidence while still maintaining that commitment, right? So one of those cases is the case where you continue to hold that belief and your credence lowers, right? Another case would be you have a commitment to practice Christianity, even in light of like really, really serious doubts. And what's interesting about that is like your credence can be like extremely low that Christianity is true, but you could still rationally practice Christianity. There would be like some like Pascal's wager kind of style reasoning behind that. So I mean, and I know that's kind of like the topic of today, but I guess the point is that there's really interesting and important ways to incorporate counter evidence and not ignore it, but still rationally continue in a commitment to Christianity. And I think people that just say like you can't question the foundations of your worldview, I think they're at least being misleading, because it kind of sounds like you shouldn't be paying attention to that evidence. And I think you absolutely should be, but that doesn't mean you have to give up your commitment.
I really appreciate that. So um, to kind of sum it up, in light of everything we've discussed, let's imagine two scenarios of someone who deconstructs, right? So what would it look like for a religious person to deconstruct and then rationally deconvert? And then on the other hand, what would it look like for a religious person to deconstruct and then rationally reconstruct within the same religious tradition? How could we go about imagining both of those scenarios?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, partially because I think there's just so many possibilities for how this might look. I'll try to highlight a couple, but I think like I can't cover the whole spectrum of ways this could look, because again, there's so many different reasons people might have questions. There's evidence-based, there's like the religious trauma stuff we were talking about, there's a lot. So yeah, I mean, the first thing I was thinking about is just cases where your evidence is genuinely changing, right? So you might start off with like tons of evidence that God exists and that Christianity is true, then get like tons of counter evidence to the point where you feel like you haven't just lowered your credence, but you've maybe given up your belief, or you like, if you get all the way to zero, then you can't even arguably rationally even act as if Christianity is true, right? And then you might kind of look at more evidence, gather more evidence, and then realize, okay, yeah, the evidence is better than I thought, right? So that would be what it would look like to deconstruct and reconstruct. Or you might just think the evidence sucks and then, stay deconstructed. So one is just, reflection on the changing of your evidence, right? That's one way you could go. Another way you could go that I think is kind of interesting is cases where your evidence actually stays fixed, but you're kind of considering different explanations of the evidence. And you kind of think like one explanation best fits your evidence. And then you kind of think, well, actually, maybe another explanation best fits my evidence. And then you kind of maybe go back to the first one or something. So maybe to take a non-religious example of this first, like you could think about when you like these like murder documentaries, or like, when they talk about like whether someone committed some crime and the evidence is really complicated. You might kind of have all the evidence in, and you're like, okay, I think Smith committed the crime. And then you think about it more and you're like, actually, wait, maybe like Smith's butler committed the crime. Maybe that's a better explanation. And then you like think about the evidence more and you're like, okay, no, wait, I actually think Smith committed the crime. So what's interesting there is that like your evidence isn't actually changing. You're just kind of like reconceiving of what best explains your evidence. And interestingly enough, I think there's actually some conversion stories that look like this. So Peter Van Inwagen, he's a philosopher at Notre Dame. And he actually said that like in the midst of his conversion, his evidence wasn't changing, but he could just go back and forth between seeing the world as theistic and seeing it as atheistic almost at will. He talked about the duck rabbit optical illusion, where you can
Yeah.
like see it as a duck, see it as a rabbit. You know what I'm talking about? He said he could do that, like seeing the world as like God created it, seeing the world as independently existing, and he just kind of went back and forth at will. And I think that's interesting because it's not that your evidence is changing; it's just that you're kind of reconceiving it, or like thinking about different ways to explain the evidence that you have. Okay, so that's the second one. And then the third one is actually cases where your desires change. So, this can, again, be a positive or a negative thing, right? You could go from, maybe you like experience some religious trauma and you think like this would be really bad if God existed. And then, something changes your desires, or you kind of like reconceive of religion in a different way than you did before. Or you like start going to a different denomination, or maybe a different religion altogether, and then you start to see that religion or that reconceived way of viewing the original religion as good. You could also just think like, oh, there's goods to religion that I didn't previously know about. So this wouldn't necessarily be a case of like religious trauma, but maybe just a case where we're like, oh yeah, like it actually would be really good if this religion were true because of XYZ reasons, fill in the blank. So this kind of like desire change could also be another reason someone might like rationally deconstruct and then possibly even reconstruct in the same religious tradition. So to summarize, there was the evidence changing view, there was the permissive view where you're going back and forth, like seeing two different explanations of your evidence, and then there was the desire changing view. And you can have all different combinations of these two, and that's why I kind of said at the beginning it's complicated, because religious commitment is a complicated matter. What makes it rational is complicated, and I don't think that like one model is going to describe every single case. But I think those are three of the sort of main models we can look at when we're thinking about deconstruction and reconstruction.
That's helpful. So you could develop new information. And for the past year, I've really been studying the historical Jesus. So that might be I read a new book and I learn new historiographical methods, or I learn about a new archaeological discovery and so on. So that could be new information or new evidence. And then it could be I reflect on the things I've already learned or the things I already know, and I consider different ways to interpret it. And then the final thing could be, as I learn more, I think this Jesus figure could be a wonderful person to know, or I could think,
Yeah.
that I could think the opposite, and my
Yeah.
desires or affections could change. And those are the three ways that someone could, or the three main motivations why someone could deconstruct. And then from there, it's just case by case whether they deconvert or reconstruct. So I think that's really helpful. I'm glad to have you on, and just as the brief conclusion to each video, I ask my guests 3 questions. And so the first is just what's something significant on which you've changed your mind? It could be from discussions or studies or just personal experiences.
Yeah, this is a great question. I will say, like, in general, since studying philosophy, I think I've just become like way less confident about a lot of things, because I just know how controversial things are and how many arguments there are for and against, and also just how much I'm unaware of. So, I think this was kind of reflected in the interview. I still think we can have beliefs about controversial issues. I just think we should really temper our confidence and make sure we're kind of open to new evidence, like on both sides of things. So that's not really a mind change, but I just think like a lot of these really controversial, like political, moral, religious stuff, like I think I've tempered my confidence somewhat since studying philosophy about those. So that's one example. I mean, I think I've changed my mind on a lot. Like, I think free will is a big one. I feel like free will is such a hard issue. And I've gone back and forth between being a libertarian and being a compatibilist like many times. And I think at this point, I like don't even know what I think, because I think it's such a hard problem. I kind of gave up. I kind of gave up. But yeah, that is one thing I kind of went back and forth on was free will. So that's maybe not the most interesting answer, but
No,
yeah.
yeah, I appreciate that. I
Mhm.
think 2 years ago, I was more confident in all of my beliefs than I am now. And
Mm,
I have to realize, especially as I interview more philosophers, because I've dedicated so much time to history, that um, that I should not
yeah.
I shouldn't inflate my own sense of my knowledge. A lot
Mm,
of these questions are probably just preliminary questions, or a lot of these things are just based on stuff I've learned in the past couple of weeks preparing for each interview. It's not like
yeah.
it's like the more I learn, the more I realize there is to learn. And so
Yeah.
yeah, you're right. It's not quite a
Absolutely.
mind change. It's just something how your perspective changes.
Yep. For sure. For sure.
And so another question is just what are some more personal factors that don't necessarily constitute propositional evidence, but they do still
Hmm.
influence your worldview?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. Interesting to think about too. So, I mean, one big one for me, I mean, arguably this is evidence, but that's controversial. I think religious experience is definitely important to me. It's the experiences I've had of God, and also just um, from my perspective, I think the beauty of the Christian story and of Jesus's life have been really influential. So, I think that it could be propositional evidence, but it's hard to share that with someone. Like, you can't just be like, oh, premise one, the universe began to exist. Premise two, if the universe began to exist, then God exists, so therefore God. Like, it's just a different kind of evidence that's like harder to share, although still really important for me, and I think does make like an epistemic difference to me. So, I mean, I think that's a big one. I also just think like the people that you surround yourself with and the people you hang out with. And I actually really strive to, like, even just on my social media, to have like a lot of people with like a big variety of views, rather than just like it all being kind of like left or right or whatever, you know. And I do think that's helped me really see how hard a lot of these controversial issues are and how there really are two sides to every story. And I just think a lot of people can miss that. Maybe that's kind of becoming the theme of our interview, is like don't be overly confident or something. But yeah, I think like both on the internet but also just in general, trying to be friends with people that have a bunch of different viewpoints and perspectives is something I've strived to do, and also I think is just really important, and definitely has influenced my worldview. And I think one thing it's just helped me realize is that people can have lots of different views and all still be rational. Like, just because someone disagrees with you doesn't mean they're automatically irrational. So, and I think there can also like there can be good arguments for things even if you don't ultimately agree with the conclusion. So it's definitely influenced me a lot, and I think also like I think that's influenced a lot of my meta views, my views about rationality, or my views about what views people should or shouldn't have, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. So finally, just any final thoughts, resources you'd recommend, advice you'd give to me or the
Mm.
audience, just anything.
Yeah, good question. So I think there is a lot of interesting work being done on the rationality of religious commitment that's kind of worth diving into. I'm trying to think if there's any like really specific things to recommend. I mean, I do have like a number of videos on my channel that like
Right.
whether it's like I have a playlist of like other interviews I've done if you're interested in that, and then like videos on faith and stuff too. So yeah, I would definitely recommend yeah, just like checking out all the stuff that philosophers have said about this, because I think it's easy to miss not just me, but you know, a lot of the work being done here, especially if you're, you know, maybe more in the popular like apologetic sphere. I think like, you know, Michelle Panchuk's work, that's someone I mentioned that I think is really, really good. A lot of other philosophers like working on faith, Pascal's wager. So like Laura Bouchak is someone else that comes to mind. She's done like really excellent work on faith. And then Catherine Dormady is another person. So these are all people that I think do really important work on this topic that is worth diving into. So yeah, in terms of advice, like not to beat a dead horse, but I've said it a lot, but I think just like not being so obsessed with certainty, I think is something I really want to drive home for Christianity, especially people who grew up in Christian circles. Like, Christian circles are really focused on belief, they're really focused on certainty, and I think they're really some of the circles are really scared of doubting and counter evidence.
Mm.
I do not think that doubting is a sin. I do not think that, again, as Christians, we're called to ignore counter evidence. And I actually think not only is that true, but these can actually be a really important part of faith. I think that faith isn't opposed to doubt, but faith is what can help us keep our commitments in light of doubt. So, I guess in terms of advice, I think that's the advice that I would give. God wants our commitment more than God wants our certainty.
Hmm. That's really good. Thank you so much for that. To our audience, thank you. I hope you've learned and you've been challenged. And to everyone, peace.